Have you ever looked at a map and wondered why Mongolia is its own country? I mean, for a huge chunk of history, Chinese empires considered it their backyard. But today, it's a completely sovereign nation. So what's the deal? Why isn't China claiming it?
Okay, let's really get into this, because it's an incredible story of power, politics, and pure ambition. You see, for centuries, Chinese dynasties kind of had this loose control over the Mongol lands. They weren't directly ruling it, but they saw it as their sphere of influence. But obviously, the map today looks totally different. So how on earth did we get from there to here?
To really wrap our heads around this, we first need to get our geography straight, because it turns out Mongolia isn't just one single thing.
Right. So historically, the Chinese empire split the region in two. You had Inner Mongolia, which was closer and much more tied to China. And then you had Outer Mongolia, which was way more remote and independent. Our whole story today is about how Outer Mongolia broke away for good and became the country we just call Mongolia.
The start of the 20th century was just total chaos. In 1911, China's last dynasty falls apart, and Outer Mongolia immediately says, "We're out," and declares independence. But China pushes back and reoccupies it a few years later. But that doesn't last either. By 1921, Mongolian revolutionaries, with a lot of help from the brand new Soviet Union next door, kicked the Chinese out for good. And by 1924, you have the Mongolian People's Republic. It's technically independent, but let's be real, it's basically living under the giant shadow of the Soviets.
So now you've got this really fragile situation, and it sets the stage for a massive three-way geopolitical chess match with the future of Mongolia right in the middle of the board.
You basically had three different groups with totally opposite goals. First, China. They saw Outer Mongolia as a runaway province that they absolutely had to get back. Then you've got the Soviet Union. They wanted Mongolia as a friendly buffer state, like a giant cushion protecting their soft underbelly in Siberia. And then you had the Mongolian nationalists, who had an even bigger, wilder dream.
Yeah, this wasn't just about keeping Outer Mongolia free. Leaders like Chaobolsan were dreaming of a great Mongolia, a massive state that would unite all the Mongol people, including those in China's Inner Mongolia. We're talking about a country stretching all the way to the Great Wall of China. Now, that dream was a huge threat to China, and it was about to become an incredibly powerful bargaining chip.
And that brings us to the absolute climax of the story. It's the end of World War II, and a single high-stakes negotiation is about to decide Mongolia's fate once and for all.
Okay, so picture this. To finally end the war, the Allies desperately need the Soviet Union to help them fight Japan. The Soviet leader, Joseph Stalin, says yes, but he's got a list of demands. And one of the biggest ones is preserving the status quo in Outer Mongolia. Now, nobody really knew what that meant, but it put Mongolia smack in the middle of the negotiating table. And China? They weren't even in the room.
This is where Stalin plays his cards like a master. He takes that Mongolian dream of a great Mongolia and uses it as a threat. He basically tells the Chinese negotiators, look, you have two choices. You can officially recognize Outer Mongolia's independence and I'll make sure they behave, or you can refuse and who knows, I might just support their little project to unite all the Mongols, which would cost you Inner Mongolia too. It was an absolutely ruthless and brilliant power play.
China's back was against the wall, so they made a historic deal. In a 1945 treaty, they agreed to let Outer Mongolia have an independence vote. But in return, Stalin gave them something huge. He recognized China's full control over the valuable territory of Manchuria and promised he'd stop stirring up trouble in another region, Xinjiang. Basically, China gave up one piece of land to secure its grip on two others. So what happened with that vote in October 1945? Well, with Soviet troops all over the country, it was hardly a surprise. The official result came back, 97% of Mongolians voted for independence. And just like that, the deal was sealed.
But look, a deal on a piece of paper is one thing. Making it real, turning a vague idea into a hard line on a map, that's a whole other story.
Now here's a really crucial point. In 1949, Mao Zedong's communists win the Chinese Civil War and take over. You'd think they might just tear up the old agreement, right? But they didn't. The new government in Beijing looked at the situation, accepted the reality, and officially recognized Mongolia's independence.
And what a reality to accept. We're talking about a massive border, over 4,600 kilometers long, that now had to be officially mapped out between the two countries.
All of that work finally led to the 1962 Sino-Mongolian Border Treaty. This thing was incredibly detailed. It came with an atlas of over 100 maps. It basically took what was a fuzzy historical frontier and turned it into a hard, permanent, internationally recognized border. This was the moment the book was slammed shut on any future Chinese claims to Mongolia.
So that brings us to today. How has Mongolia, a country literally sandwiched between two of the world's biggest powers, Russia and China, managed to stay independent and even thrive? Well, they've done it with a really smart foreign policy they call the third neighbor policy. The logic is brilliant. If you're stuck between two giants, you make friends with powerful countries far away. They build strong relationships all over the globe with so-called third neighbors to make sure they're never too dependent on Russia or China. It's a classic balancing act. And a perfect example of this is the United States. The U.S. has become a major strategic partner for Mongolia. Since the 1990s, America has invested over $1 billion there. That money is crucial for helping Mongolia build an economy that doesn't just rely on its two giant neighbors.
And you can see the results of this strategy in the lives of everyday people. Mongolia's Human Development Index, which is basically a score for health, education, and quality of life, has shot up since they became a democracy and opened up to the world. Their sovereignty has delivered real, tangible progress.
So why doesn't China claim Mongolia? Well, it's a story of an empire collapsing, a new nation's dream, and one incredibly shrewd geopolitical bargain. But really, it's more than that. It's the story of how a nation, once just a pawn in someone else's game, figured out how to write its own destiny. Which kind of leaves you with one big question. In a world full of giants, how does any small nation write its own story?